Well, it seems that the weekly patch knows best. Just when I thought that the sheer amount of stuff from the last weekly patch to talk about would be a one-off, this week the Thinker team has dropped another banger. Not one, but two new cards, randomized balancing changes, and arguably the biggest change in the history of the weekly patch, nerfs to Arcovian Knights. Because if you're familiar with my content, you know exactly how much I've wanted across-the-board nerfs to Arcovian enemies. Also, Brokelite Lake's boosted drop rates have been moved over to Arrow Peaks, which is very convenient for the new cards players can get. This video will be all of my thoughts on the new weekly patch, since it's much easier to just listen to a video than read multiple pages of writing. Just like the last weekly patch analysis, we're going to start with the smaller stuff and work our way up. First up, the Arcovian Knight nerfs. This was a long time coming. In case you haven't watched the Arcova rant, Arcovian Knights have been oppressive for a while, especially after getting Cold Glare in a previous weekly patch to bolster their output even higher than it was before. They had everything all at once in their deck and the health to use it. And trust me, it showed when fighting 4 of them in the Snowville Castle raid. Arcovian Knights issues were finally addressed in this weekly patch. First off, Arcovian Knights bulk. Their health has been lowered from 450 to 400, and they no longer have Blue Elixir in their deck. This means that any damage you get past their 50% Frost Armor is permanent unless other enemies which can heal them are present, and they're slightly less bulkier because of the health nerf. However, these weren't the only changes Arcovian Knight received, as Arcovian Knight got a crucial change on the offense end as well. While Cold Glare is still in its deck, it now costs 1 bit and applies 2 turns of freeze instead of 1. This means Cold Glare is no longer a fire starter, and Arcovian Knights won't instantly spam it whenever they pull it, which greatly lowers the possible damage they'll typically deal with Arcova Bolt. I find these changes to tone down Arcovian Knight good to a degree where you can very likely casual them without having a teammate die on turn 8 out of their control. Good job. Second, there's the Reanimated Mage nerf. While Reanimated Mage isn't something I'd find extremely urgent to rebalance like the Arcovians, this enemy does have its problems. The combination of 200 health, 3 regen per turn, Disable, a card which neutralizes a single target with 0 counterplay, and Unvoidable Global Disease application in Pandemic could be a nightmare in Drowned Pass under the right circumstances. Additionally, a disruption-based mage enemy having the same health as Reanimated Guard, the defensive-based reanimated enemy of the bunch, was a little confusing in design. These issues got addressed in the weekly patch. Reanimated Mage got a health reduction from 200 to 175. The slight cut in health makes its disruption kit a little more fair than it previously was, and plays into what we've seen with mage enemies having less health at the benefit of stronger output. This is a good change that will probably make casualing Drowned Pass a little less headache-inducing. If you're at this point in the video, I'd just like to say thanks for watching. If you like what you're seeing, feel free to leave a like on the video. If you want to know when more content drops, feel free to also subscribe. I have a big project in the works that you don't want to miss. Third, there's the randomized balancing changes, and this week there's 5 of them. However, this week there's been some meaningful changes to cards which have struggled for a long time that I'm excited to get into discussing. Since they're both similar to each other, we'll go over them first in a pair. Ministrations and Mantra got a buff, increasing their revitalized durations from 2 to 4 and 4 to 5 respectively. This is a pretty good buff to support decks as a whole, since it gives people who use support decks more time to follow up with extra heals on the target they applied Revitalize to. I also find this to be an indirect buff to Self-Eternal Flame deck, since the increased Revitalize duration pairs well with Manipulate the Eternal, the de facto self-sustain card for Self-Eternal Flame. Next up, Everfrost Axe got its AoE effect reworked. Previously, this card applied a 5 damage Frostbite effect that lasted for 4 turns, so all enemies in a 1 AoE radius of the target. But let's be honest, who's running Everfrost Axe in a Frostbite deck for the Frostbite? Now, Everfrost Axe's AoE effect is 15 base damage to all enemies in a 1 AoE radius of the target. The main target still takes only 70 base damage. It's not 85 base damage, as it's not included in the radius. This is obviously a better secondary effect for Everfrost Axe. Frostbite didn't make that much sense, since most of the time, enemies adjacent to your target were within melee range of you already, so you wouldn't get the Frostbite damage procced, whereas a simple 15 base damage is much more consistent. This might actually give Everfrost Axe a niche over Darksteel Longblade, but only time will tell. Following the silly buff shot axe, Mutate Health got a meaningful buff that's going to help out zombie decks a lot. I saw one word on its balancing change and instantly knew this was huge for the card. That's right. Mutate Health's enrage duration is no longer 15 turns, it's permanent now. Its enrage potency also got increased from 10 to 15, which is much more realistic for a Void card. While Mutate Death could permanently increase a zombie's attacking output, players didn't have that many options to permanently increase its health outside of Ancient Prayer and Destructive Chant, both 3-cost cards. However, now there's a cheaper option to reliably increase a zombie's longevity and add some mutation points to it for a potential late-game Necrotic Offering sweep. This is going to help out zombie decks a lot, which is a good change, although Mutate Pestilence and Mutate Famine are still in a really bad spot. The last card balancing change was none other than Arms Race getting nerfed. Ever since the downfall of Sugar Rush, there was a valid case for Arms Race being the best pick gain in the game. You get a turn of Inspire and 3 turns of Bravery at the downside of giving an enemy 3 turns of Bravery and giving yourself 7 turns of 2 potency burnout. With this weekly patch, the burnout potency has been increased to 3. While Arms Race is still very good, it's now much more risky to use 2 in a short time frame, as you'll be capped at 2 max bits instead of 4, and just using 1 will lock you out of 6 cost cards now, like Meteor Strike and Regrowth. While it hurts to see Arms Race get nerfed, admittedly this nerf was needed, and I think it was done in a fair way that doesn't gut the card like how Sugar Rush's nerf was done. Finally, the meat of the weekly patch. Whereas previous weekly patches that had new cards attached to them only released 1, 2 were actually released this patch, Accelerata and Lunatic's Repose, and there's a lot to be discussed about the pair of new cards. At the time of Haste's nerf, there wasn't really competition to it, but now there is with Accelerata. For 1 bit, you can give a target Bravery and Swiftness for 3 turns. If the target has 4 or less cards in their hand, the cost of this card is refunded and the target draws 2 random attack cards from their deck. However, this card can't be used when under fatigue. This card is going to greatly help Aeromancy decks out, and here's why. Since some of the most reliable Gale Blast build-up cards are quick play, you'll usually be playing multiple cards per turn if you have the bits for it, and you get a bit refund from Accelerata if you have 4 or less cards in your hand, allowing you to set up the Swiftness conditional for Aerobic Flow, draw some extra cards over the next few turns if your hand allows you to, and potentially pull an Electroblast or Gale Blast for a net of 0 bits. Of course, you'd still have to pay 1 bit up front, but it's a net of 0 bits. You're not always going to be in this scenario where you pull everything you want and also have the bits to use what you've pulled, and that's why I find this card fair. If you're in the best case scenario, then that's great. You get to maintain your momentum. If you're not in the best case scenario, then that's fine too. Accelerata helps your Aeromancy deck out by setting up the Swiftness conditional for Aerobic Flow, as I've already mentioned, and then giving you some extra card draws to hopefully get some momentum going. It's fair competition for Haste at a time where it needed it, so I find this to be a good yet fair addition. Before this weekly patch, Mask of Uncertainty was also in the same spot as Haste, where it got nerfed, but there was a lack of viable competition for it at the time. Equilibria was always held back by too many restrictions on the card, and has never really been meaningful competition to Mask of Uncertainty. Fortunately, the next attempt to make competition for Mask of Uncertainty seems to be a success in the form of Lunatic's Repose. For 1 bit, you can reshuffle your hand back in your deck and draw that many cards. You then heal equal to the amount of cards drawn times the highest cost card drawn, with X cost being 8. If you're below 20% health, this effect is repeated. As Lunatic's Repose costs a bit to use, obviously you're going to get a lot more out of it compared to Mask of Uncertainty, which costs none. And what you get is fair for the cost, since spending a bit on a hand reroll is kind of pricey. You get cards equal to the amount reshuffled, unlike Mask of Uncertainty, which is cards equal to the amount reshuffled minus 2. And entirely unique to Lunatic's Repose, you get a chip heal along with it, which on average is about 15 to 30. Of course, you can increase the odds of Lunatic's Repose healing you more, but that requires running a much more expensive deck compared to a more efficient deck. Lunatic's Reuse conditional can also help Dark Frenzy decks out, as it heals you more on low health, but honestly just unvoid Dark Frenzy, it needs it. And reroll cards are a must-have when making decks, and now players have an actual choice to make instead of the very obvious Uncertainty over Equilibria. Would you rather take the cheaper 0-cost option, which draws less than you reshuffle, or would you rather take the more expensive 1-cost option, which draws equal to what got reshuffled and gives you a small heal? For a card made up more or less on the spot, this is an amazing addition. However, while we're still on the topic of hand rerolls, I think that Equilibria still needs its own change to make it some actual competition for Uncertainty too. Quick play means you don't have to invest a full turn into using it. 0 cost means you don't have to invest a bit into using it. Either of these options would probably do the trick when Equilibria already has a noticeable little minimum range downside attached to it. Alright, last week's weekly patch was a step in the right direction. This week's weekly patch was more of the same. Another step in the right direction. While the fun gimmick of randomness of weekly patches is still present, there are also fixes to an overly oppressive enemy, meaningful balancing changes to cards which have needed them for a while now, and actual competition to cards which had a lack of competition. Overall, this is another good weekly patch. Well done.